The primary organ of the integumentary system is the skin, and the skin is also called the cutaneous membrane. There are also accessory structures associated with the skin and the integumentary system, and that include your hair, your nails, and certain glands associated with the skin. Your skin is made up of multiple layers of different types of tissue. The two primary layers are the epidermis and the dermis. The epidermis is the superficial covering of the skin. So this is the part of your skin that you can actually touch. The dermis is the underlying connective tissue of the skin. The hypodermis is not technically part of the cutaneous membrane, but we often talk about it along with the skin because it helps the skin perform some of its functions. So technically it's the subcutaneous membrane, and it includes primarily fat or adipose tissue and other connective tissue that's deep to the dermis. So let's start by looking at the structure of the epidermis. The epidermis is made up of stratified squamous epithelium. So if you remember from the lesson on tissues, stratified means that there are multiple layers of cells. Squamous means that the cells on the surface are kind of flattened, and then epithelium is just the type of tissue it is. So this kind of lighter color here is showing the epidermis, and so the surface is going to be the squamous cells, and then the deeper layer is actually where new cells are made. So your epidermis is constantly replacing itself. So as the old cells up here slough off and are exfoliated off, you have stem cells down here at the base that are replicating themselves and multiplying in order to make new cells. And so as new cells are made here, older cells get pushed to the surface and they die as they get closer to the surface. So you can see here that there are multiple layers of cells. So this is looking at an example of a cross-section of the epidermis. The stem cells are down here, and they are actively dividing in order to make new cells. And as they divide, they push the older cells up to the surface where they start to die. The majority of the cells in the epidermis are the keratinocytes. Keratinocytes are cells that produce the protein keratin. And keratin is just a hard protein that gives skin its strength. It's also somewhat waterproof. And keratin is also the same protein that's found in your nails and your hair. It's also in the horn of a rhinoceros, and it covers the shell of a turtle. So it's a really strong protein that has a lot of different kind of protective functions in different animals. In addition to the keratinocytes, the epidermis also has some melanocytes down at the base. But you'll notice all these yellow ones are keratinocytes, but there are only a few melanocytes, so they're not as abundant as the keratinocytes. And melanocytes, their main function is to produce a pigment called melanin. And melanin is the pigment that makes your skin look darker, so it gives you kind of a brown tone to it. Now, melanin serves a purpose in that it protects the DNA of your skin cells from UV radiation. So people that have darker skin have more melanin, and they're less likely to get skin cancer. And that's because they have more protection from UV radiation. Whereas people with lighter skin have less melanin and they have less protection and are therefore more likely to get skin cancer. Also, the moles and the freckles on your body, those are just kind of clumps of melanocytes producing a lot of melanin in that area. Also, when you get a tan, so when you go out to the beach and lay out in the sun or something and you get a tan, that's your body trying to make more melanin in order to protect you from the increase in UV exposure that you're experiencing. In the epidermis, there are also some immune cells and sensory receptors. So the immune cells help if you get a scrape or a cut. Those immune cells are a pretty early part of your defense mechanisms in order to fight off bacteria and keep it from getting deeper into your skin. And the sensory receptors can be involved in things like touch, vibration, pain, heat, movement. So these sensory receptors just help you experience the external environment and know what's going on around you. Now we know that the surface of the epidermis is exposed to the external environment, and it has a lot of different functions associated with it. So first of all, we have several layers of dead keratinocytes filled with keratin. And remember that the keratinocytes are alive down here, but they die as they're pushed to the surface. And so the surface cells are dead cells just full of this keratin protein. And these are the cells that are sacrificial. They help provide your body with protection from mechanical stresses. So if you bump into something or if your skin rubs up against something, you're going to lose some of your surface epithelial cells, but that's okay because that's their job. That is their function. Because there are also so many layers of epithelial cells, and that keratin helps to give your skin a bit of a waterproofing property to it. It helps to keep stuff outside from getting deeper into your body. So you might have bacteria landing on the surface of your skin, or a fungus, or a virus, and your skin, as long as it is intact, does a pretty good job of keeping things from getting to the deeper portions of your body and causing problems. The epidermis also helps to hold moisture in your body, so it keeps moisture on the outside, but it keeps moisture on the inside. So it helps to prevent dehydration. And as we mentioned, your epidermis is basically an assembly line for cells. So you're constantly making new epidermal cells, and those cells are getting pushed to the surface, and you're constantly losing the surface cells. But those surface cells are going to be replaced by the next layer down here. The layer just deep to the epidermis is the dermis, and as I showed you, it's this area here, and it's primarily made up of connective tissue. The majority of that connective tissue is made up of protein fibers called collagen and elastin. Collagen helps to give the dermis some strength, and elastin helps to give it some flexibility. And it's actually, as we age, these protein fibers stop doing their job as well as they should, and that's what leads to wrinkles with old age, because the collagen and the elastin fibers start to break down, and your dermis isn't as it's not as firm as it started out as. There are also a lot of blood vessels in the dermis, and those blood vessels bring oxygen and nutrients to skin cells. And those skin cells those nutrients are also, they diffuse up into the deeper layers of the epidermis. So you may notice that if you just have a superficial scrape on your arm, it doesn't bleed. And that's because you're only affecting the epidermis, and the epidermis doesn't have blood vessels. But if you scrape yourself deep enough that you bleed, it means that you've now scraped all the way through the epidermis and you have hit the blood vessels in the dermis. The dermis also has nerves, so it houses some of its own sensory receptors for different things like touch and vibration and heat and pressure. And also hair follicles and sweat glands are kind of rooted in the dermis. So you can see here, this is a hair, and this is the hair follicle, and it digs deep into the dermis. Sweat glands, such as this one right here, is also based deep in the dermis with a tube that connects it to the surface of the skin. Your dermis is also responsible for giving you your fingerprints. So your fingerprints are left places because of the oil on the surface of the epidermis. But the reason why you have those ridges on your epidermis is because this is the dermis down here. And then you've got the papillary layer. So this is just another layer of the dermis. And then this up here is your epithelial tissue. But you can see how the dermis has these little projections that create little bumps. And the epidermis also has those bumps. It's not as dramatic, but they're still there. And then that's what causes your fingerprints. If you watched the movie Men in Black back in the day, there's a scene where they supposedly burn the fingerprints off of one of the Men in Black agents. And that's basically impossible to do unless you are affected by maybe a 3rd or a 4th degree burn, which would affect the dermis, and that would be a lot more painful and it would cause a lot of scarring. So it's not easy to burn your fingerprints off, so don't try. And then the hypodermis, once again, it's not technically part of the skin. We also call it the subcutaneous membrane because sub means like underneath, and cutaneous membrane is skin. So it's underneath the skin, and it helps to connect the skin to the fascia, which is the connective tissue of bones and muscles. It also has a lot of adipose tissue, and the adipose tissue is just another way of saying fat. And that fat helps to store energy. It provides insulation against heat loss, and it also provides some cushioning for when you're sitting down or if you bump into something. That adipose tissue helps to almost act kind of like an airbag in order to keep that mechanical stress from affecting deeper structures.